murder, and how investigators eventually come to learn that he died at the hands of a jealous, green-eyed killer. February 27, 2018. A man is found unresponsive in his home in Deltona, Florida.
The call was made by Jessica Devnani. She was the victim's girlfriend.
That very morning, I woke up and I called him and he didn't answer the phone, which I thought was weird because he always answers every phone call.
Jessica goes to work but then receives an unexpected phone call from her ex-boyfriend, Gregory Bender, a man she has a restraining order against for his previous threatening behavior.
I got the phone call from Bender. I felt that my heart dropped. There was no answer, so I called his brother. His brother said he hadn't heard from him. So I told his brother, I said, please, can you call Patrick's dad, Max, and try to get a hold of him because Patrick's dad, Max, lived in the same residence. Max said he will call Sharon, his girlfriend, and he said that he would have her visit the residence to check on Patrick.
So Shannon was actually the first one that arrived on scene, but they were pretty simultaneous when they both got there.
The property was a rather large-sized property, heavily wooded, but the access road to get to the property had a gate.
The gate was locked. And so I went around the side, around the bushes, and I remember my pants getting caught in the bushes and tearing, but I just needed to get to Patrick right away. And I remember being on the phone with Patrick's brother, and I heard like his tone all of a sudden change because Patrick's brother was also on the phone with Max. So I believe that Sharon had told Max what she had found. I said, what's wrong? Is Patrick okay? He was silent. He didn't say anything. And that's when I finally got to the property and I ran to the front door. And that's when I saw Patrick on the floor. And that scene, it's an image that unfortunately stays with me forever.
Law enforcement officers are at the address within minutes.
Shortly after, the police did arrive, and Max, Patrick's dad, did arrive as well. And I just remember my world is just ended.
As we arrived on scene, we were met by the initial responding deputies that discovered his body. We had talked to them, kind of got a brief of everything that they had learned. The door was partly open. You could see that there had been multiple shots fired, multiple bullets not only hit him, but also went into the home.
When we determined that Patrick had been the victim of a homicide and that he had been shot, then we went into what kind of ballistics are here that we can collect, that we can maybe match to something later on down the road.
Forensic experts are also able to recover samples from the house.
We could see that the bullets had traveled. We see that they had gone through multiple things throughout the house. The glass through the front door, we could see where the bullet holes had gone through the wall. So we began checking the adjacent room to the house, which actually was like a garage. And while they were in there and looking for that, they discovered one of the fired projectiles inside a bottle of glue and another one in a piece of wood.
These shell casings were unique. 300 blackout. It's not something that we commonly see on these types of cases. And they were near the doorway of the home where Patrick was found. Now, these are key pieces of evidence because, again, if we can collect those ballistics in the form of shell casings or projectiles, if we can find a weapon, it would be a fingerprint to that weapon and unique to that weapon.
They go upstairs and they look in the apartment, but there's no DVR, which was connected to the surveillance system that Patrick had put in. There's no laptop, so there's things that should be in the apartment that are definitely missing.
While crime scene investigators are searching the property, police try to piece together the events leading up to the fatal shooting of Patrick.
The most important thing, get the story from the family, find out as much background as you can about Patrick and who might want to do something like this to him, because obviously it was not a random killing.
We are in the evidence collection phase. We're collecting everything that we might think is relevant to this case.
They're looking for any initial clue they can get. But more importantly than the crime scene is talking to the people. So making contact with Jessica, making contact with Max.
I immediately interviewed Max and Jessica and Shannon. Those would be my first interviews to just kind of find a background story. Why did they think that there may have been something wrong?
And from Jessica, they got the information about Gregory Bender.
I informed the police that I know this is my ex, Gregory Bender. He's been stalking us and harassing us this whole time, and I have a restraining order against him, and I know it's him.
She said, Gregory Bender was much older than me. I've been in a relationship with him for a few years. I broke it off with him because I found out that he was married. She said, I moved on, I gotta get on with my life, I can't be with this man, he's married. Well, Bender didn't take this very lightly.
Police also learn about a recent dispute between Patrick and the neighbor.
When we started talking to our witnesses, they had mentioned that perhaps a person of interest would have been a neighbor that lived to the left of Patrick, because Patrick and Patrick's father may have had some run-ins with this person.
There had been contact and an issue at some point between Patrick and the neighbor. So that's something they initially, that they're like, okay, we've got to look at this as well. But the first thing they wanted to do was figure out who could harm him, who would have that motive.
But the background check quickly rules the neighbor out as a suspect.
We were able to do a background check on him and found out that he could not have been the person who committed the crime, because he was not available that day, because we had a tight timeline. We know when Patrick was last alive, and we have an idea when Patrick was shot.
The neighbors ruled out actually pretty easily once they looked into it, because he was incarcerated at the time that Patrick was murdered. So they knew it could not be him. And once they talked to Jessica and they found out about some of the things Gregory Bender had done over the past 6 to 12 months, they zeroed in on him very quickly.
You go with what lead is the most promising, and that time it was very clear that he was the most promising lead.
A lot of our attention now focuses towards Greg Bender, and everything that we saw at the crime scene, the things we have learned from the witnesses, are pointing to him as being a strong person of interest.
Investigators now make the unusual decision to try and contact Bender through Jessica.
One thing that we tried to do is have Jessica call him and maybe appeal to Bender's human side to find out, did he really kill Patrick?
They wanted to do a controlled phone call that if I call him, to try to get him to speak the truth. He was just saying, oh, I'm sorry about Patrick. I saw it on the news. And I was like, wow. I was like, you did this. You know you did this. He's like, no, I did not do this.
He did not give any other indication that he was the person that committed the crime. No emotion.
With Bender denying any involvement in Patrick's murder, investigators move quickly to build their case against him.
Once we identified Greg Bender as who we believe to be the killer, we had to start building a case. We have our suspect, we have our motive. So on one end of the case is the crime scene unit, and they're processing all the physical evidence, the DNA, the fingerprints, all those things. That takes time. It has to go to a lab, it has to be compared. There's a lot of things, and that really builds your case.
Bender had called Jessica earlier that day. That was in a direct violation of the injunction for protection, which had been filed in the Orlando area. And so we were able to use our counterparts over there, let them know that Bender had violated the injunction, and then Bender was originally arrested on the violation of the injunction.
I remember getting the phone call that Bender was arrested for the injunction. And then I do remember getting another phone call saying he was let go on bail and that they were going to try to do everything they can to see justice.
Patrick de la Cerda's family and friends are stunned by their sudden loss.
Patrick was the life of the party. Any room you would go to, he would light it up, and he was so full of energy. He always lived every day to the fullest.
His mother told us he was just full of love and compassion. He liked to hike and spend time outdoors.
Patrick was everything I ever wanted. Like, he was just the dream guy. A breath of fresh air after Greg Bender.
It was kind of love at first sight. They met, they fell in love, things just progressed very quickly. They ended up getting engaged. They had plans. They were going to move down to South Florida, the West Palm Beach area. They had their careers lined up. They each had, jobs that they had found down there, and they were ready to start a life together away from Gregory Bender.
But what happens on February 27th changes everything in an instant.
The best day of my life is when he proposed to me. It was in December. Not too long after, I spent a beautiful day on the boat with Patrick's mom, and I just thought, it was gonna be the best year of my life coming up. I'm just gonna have everything I ever wanted, and I just thought I was gonna live a fairy tale, but it was the worst year coming up of my entire life.
In February 2018, police in Florida have begun an investigation into the brutal murder of Patrick de la Cerda at his home in Deltona. In their search for information, their first port of call is Patrick's girlfriend, Jessica.
Jessica, in her interview, she said something just wasn't right. And digging down deep with that, she said that she had an ex-boyfriend, and his name was Gregory Bender. And they had been together for a few years, and that Gregory Bender was a jealous type. So much so that she had to get an injunction for protection against Gregory Bender.
Here in Florida, we call them injunction for protections, restraining orders. Some perpetrators are scared off by the idea that law enforcement will really come to protect the victim. Some don't care.
Gregory Bender lived in a wealthy community outside of Orlando, appeared to be smart, was into finance. He had dated Jessica, who was much younger than him, for several years, and were engaged.
Back in 2009, we had met online. I was dating someone else for about 2 months until Bender found out, and he didn't like that. He was actually stalking us at the time, and he had pulled me aside one day and he said that I need to leave that person, and if I don't leave them, that he would do some harm to them. He said that I had to continue my relationship with him, give it a try and see if I liked him. So that's what I did. I continued the relationship with Bender.
Oftentimes, people who are not trained and don't understand domestic violence will show a picture of a happy couple and say, well, look, they were just happy last week. And if you have somebody who's not trained, they could buy into that, not understanding that the survivor in that situation is trying to stay alive. And they're smiling for the picture to protect themselves.
One time when Bender was in the hospital, and Jessica came up on in a sense, a surprise visit, and she encountered a woman in that hospital room, an older woman.
She then said that she's his wife, and she showed me her ring, and I was like, well, I'm his fiance, and I showed her my ring.
Jessica knew about him having a relationship in the past with somebody. I mean, obviously, somebody his age is going to have prior relationships, but I don't think Jessica would have gotten engaged to a man if she thought he was involved with somebody else.
He was able to manipulate her and keep the fact that he, Bender, was actually married.
And then, of course, Bender was just, get out, because he was in front of the mirror, and he just told me to leave, so I left. And then not too shortly, after a few days, he was contacting me again, saying, I'm so sorry, I had to tell you to leave, because she was there.
Mr. Bender obviously had to explain himself to Jessica, as anybody would, and his excuse was painting himself in a good light, making himself seem like a Samaritan. He wanted to make sure that his wife's son got to attend the good schools in Windermere.
Windermere is known to be a high-class address.
A nice part of Orange County, Windermere, where, my understanding, people like Tiger Woods, Shaquille O'Neal all had places. And he explains to Jessica that the marriage to the woman that she saw in the hospital room was arranged.
Why did I marry my wife? I married my wife because I wanted to save my house. My house was back on debt because I had lost my job. And the only way I could save my house was to either do a mortgage refinance or to pay off about $80,000 in back-owed mortgage payments. I didn't have the $80,000, so I needed to do the mortgage refinance in order to save the house. In order to get a mortgage refinance, I needed my wife's income and her credit rating so I could fill out a piece of paper, get the refi done in 3 months, and then divorce her. So it was a business relationship.
Jessica and the other woman knew about each other. So Jessica was living under thoughts that Gregory was leaving his wife for her, but he couldn't yet because she had a small child and she had nowhere to go, and he kind of had this story. On the other hand, his wife, she knew about Jessica, she didn't like it, and she was wanting to get out of the marriage, but again, she was trying to get her affairs in order. She had a child, she had to find a place to live and kind of move on.
I just told him, you have till the end of the year. Like, it was just conversations that we had. And he's like, no, just give me a little bit more time. Just give me a little bit more time. I'm gonna make it happen. I couldn't take it. So I slowly tried to break off the relationship.
Both these women, I think, were scared of him, but they both made an effort to placate him, to almost satisfy him just enough that he wouldn't do something rash and violent.
With Bender's relationship between the two women in his life in transition, Jessica finally works up the courage to leave Bender and meets Patrick de la Cerda in 2017.
They happened to find each other through online dating, and the relationship progressed rather quickly. Within 6 months, he was so in love with her that he knew that she was the one for him and proposed to her.
As soon as we met, I knew he was the one. Like, we just hit it off right away. He was always happy. He was never sad or angry. It was amazing. It was like a fairy tale.
But Bender didn't leave Jessica alone.
Gregory Bender overreacted as soon as he found out that Jessica was seeing somebody else, and he had done this before. Jessica had been seeing somebody else, and Bender had incredibly overreacted, made threats, talked about where the person lived.
I knew that he couldn't harm me because he always said that he can't harm someone that he loves. He could easily harm someone else that he doesn't love. And I always believed if I was to ever date someone, I was always afraid for them.
She's been under his control for so many years. She's a victim of domestic violence, but it was mental abuse. It wasn't physical abuse. He wasn't punching her and hitting her and doing those type of things. He had just wore her down mentally to where she was afraid of him.
Domestic violence usually starts with other tactics to control a person, and often we don't see violence erupting in a relationship unless the other tactics are not working. So there's a lot of other things that could happen to control a person without the violence.
Bender would harass Jessica, calling her repeatedly, reaching out to her family, stalking her on social media, showing up to her work.
They had a confrontation there that was traumatic for her, but most of his threats were not towards her, because at the end of the day, what Gregory Bender wanted by telling Jessica that he was going to kill Patrick was Jessica back.
Jessica applies for a restraining order against Bender, but it's not so easy.
When the police came to my job, at the time, Bender was still calling me and sending me those voice messages. I had the police officer listen to the voice message.
So if you want to call me, call me. She's gone. I'm here all night. I'm free. Okay? Just call me, and I'll tell you what happened. And I won't ask you any questions. I'll just tell you. Okay?
And they're like, well, it still doesn't mean anything. We can't do anything based on verbal harassment. They even called Bender and spoke with him, and they said, oh, he seems fine. Like, he seems totally cool and collected. And I was like, yes, that's Bender. He's very conniving that way. But we did finally get my restraining order filed at court.
It seems that Gregory Bender's obsession with Jessica and her relationship with Patrick becomes increasingly intense.
As soon as he saw our relationship on Facebook, he immediately messaged Patrick, and he messaged me, and he said that I know everything. I know where Patrick lives. I found his address. I found his mom's address. He was also telling the same thing to Patrick. And he said, I'm gonna come to you guys. I'm gonna harm you guys.
Bender turned his focus towards his replacement. And that's how he viewed Patrick, his replacement. And he started to harass Patrick.
You can find anything about anybody on social media, and he learned a ton about Patrick on social media. Even finding Patrick's phone number, contacting Patrick directly. You could see Patrick's fear of Gregory Bender in multiple ways, blocking the number, trying to get an injunction or a restraining order himself. But also, that's why he bought the surveillance system.
Patrick took it very seriously. He did get a security system installed at his residence as well. And Patrick also tried to get a restraining order, but it was denied at the time.
At the beginning of 2018, both women have ended their relationship with Gregory Bender, and he isn't happy.
Nobody tells Greg Bender no. And when he was told no, his recourse was to eliminate whatever's in his way. And what was in his way to win back Jessica was Patrick.
To retaliate, he begins a campaign of harassment against Patrick de la Cerda, and police are now discovering that Bender had developed a complex plan. February 2018, Deltona, Florida. Police are investigating the murder of Patrick de la Cerda, who was shot dead in his home in a seemingly random attack. But Patrick's girlfriend, Jessica, informs them of the threatening behavior of her jealous ex-boyfriend, Gregory Bender. Bender has a restraining order against him from contacting Jessica and had previously made threats towards Patrick.
With the restraining order, Bender was not allowed to call me, message me, no form of contact whatsoever. He was not allowed to come near my workplace or my house. And I also listed Patrick's residence in the restraining order because I did live there as well.
When Jessica had broken things off with Gregory Bender, he would call her over and over and over again. And when he couldn't get her, then he would harass Jessica's sister, and he would call her over and over and over again and leave some alarming voicemails.
Hey, Vanessa, I sent you the note so you have it. Can you please send that to her tomorrow night when she comes back, or Monday morning when she's coming back? Don't send it over when she's at his place because she'll just erase it.
Bender's obsession with Jessica and his intense hatred of Patrick had been progressively increasing leading up to the murder.
I can't believe you did this to me and your sister again, and you let her do this, and you didn't tell me about this. This is going to end. He is going to end. I can't believe you did this. Call me now, or all hell is going to break loose.
During our interviews, we learned that Patrick's father had received a phone call from someone posing to be a delivery driver. Max got off the phone with the delivery driver, tried to get a hold of Patrick. He was unable to do so. He called the phone number back. The unknown male answered, but didn't really say a whole lot, didn't want him calling him again. Hey, you can't call this phone number. So he hung up. Now, fast forward a little bit, when we're interviewing Max, things start coming back. He starts putting the pieces together. You know, Greg Bender, he knows the history with them, and he's certain that the voice he heard was Greg Bender's voice prior to the murder.
Detective Sergeant Weaver very smartly talked to Orange County, because the injunction was out of Orlando, notified them about the contact to get him in custody.
They were able to arrest Bender in the terms of violating the injunction.
Gregory Bender had violated his injunction for protection against her, which is an automatic arrest in Florida.
Detectives are now sure they're getting close to finding out what really happened to Patrick de la Cerda. And the conversation police have with Bender's ex-wife lead them to a document full of some highly relevant information.
A day or so into our investigation, we also received a phone call from Bender's wife. And so she says, I might have some information that might help your case. So detectives went over to Orlando area and talked to her. And what they learned was very interesting.
Months prior to this murder, she had discovered a notebook that belonged to Greg. And she used to see him writing in it and different things and didn't really know what it was, thought it was some sort of journal. One day when he wasn't home, she went through the notebook and she had discovered a murder plan.
Bender's wife had seen the so-called plan late the previous year.
Schematics of Patrick's house, a playbook that Bender wrote of how he would do the crime, how he would get in, how he would get out, how he would cover his tracks by throwing away evidence. This information that was provided to us by Bender's wife led us to be able to get a search warrant for Bender's home in Windermere.
He was also still incarcerated at the jail at the time. We kind of devised a plan. Hey, we're going to execute this search warrant, but we also want to know when he's released and when he's coming home. So we had a surveillance unit at the jail watching him so we could know when he was going to be released and when to expect him back at the house.
They arrived at the house and searched the house up and down, and they found a small armory of weapons, ammunition, body armor, some cellular devices, which we ended up getting into later.
While we're doing the search warrant, we get the phone call, hey, he's been released for jail. He just got picked up by somebody, and we don't know who they are or where he's going. So they continue following him, and it looks like he's coming back to the house.
In Bender's office, what I recall in the trash can was a crumpled up piece of paper. And in this crumpled up piece of paper was the murder plan that his wife had referred to.
The meticulous details that were in this murder plan and the meticulous steps he took to commit the murder, it's almost unbelievable and just shocking that he would forget something so simple as tossing the murder plan in a trash can and not throwing it away. That gave us premeditation to show to a jury, but we needed a way to physically tie him to the crime scene.
We found ammunition, unfired 300 blackout ammunition. But the key part of what we found in Bender's home is a spent shell casing from 300 blackout.
That really gave us what we needed to, it's like, okay, we have enough. Let's go write up an arrest warrant and let's arrest him. So I leave and I go start typing up our arrest warrant. I get it signed by a judge. Now that it's signed and once we're ready to arrest him, Craig Bender pulls up in the driveway of his house, and that's where he's taken into custody.
And we took that opportunity to talk to him. I specifically remember sitting down with him in his kitchen. I said, do you know why we're here? Do you know what this is all about? He chose to invoke his right to an attorney. He sat and did not give us anything.
One thing we didn't find was the firearm that we believed matched the murder weapon. But we did find a 30-round kind of high-capacity magazine for an assault style, like an AR-15 style rifle that had ammunition in it that matched some of the casings that were found from the scene.
We send those shell casings, the one from Patrick's home, the one collected from Bender's home, send it to the lab, and then we receive the results that the markings on the casings are an exact match. How did Bender have 300 blackout ammo in a drawer in his house in Windermere, more than 50 miles away? That doesn't happen.
Investigators have strong physical evidence linking Gregory Bender to Patrick's murder, but they still need to focus all their resources to build a solid case against him in court. March 2018. Police are now sure they have identified the killer of 25-year-old Patrick de la Cerda, who was found dead at his home in Deltona, Florida in February of that year. Detectives believe Patrick has been the victim of his girlfriend's jealous ex-lover, a man named Gregory Bender.
I knew it was Bender as soon as I got the voice call at work. I could sense it. Something terrible has happened.
The investigating team has moved at high speed.
Once the arrest is made, really for us, the work now begins. We have to put the case together, making our case stronger. A lot of that cell phone information that we got, a lot of the physical evidence, those type of things.
One discovery at the property really convinced police that Bender was their man.
He took the video surveillance. He didn't want to be caught. What he didn't do is he didn't get rid of any evidence that he had brought from Patrick's home to his home. Finding that one key piece of evidence in Bender's home in Windermere, the spent 300 blackout shell casing, is evidence that we can now compare to fired spent shell casings that we found at Patrick's home.
I think he saved that shell casing as a token. That was his reward. He had killed Patrick and he was going to save that shell casing as his trophy.
Law enforcement got the casing from Gregory Bender's home and got the two casings from the crime scene, which he did not see and forgot to pick up. And they were able to look at him under a microscope and see that there was really no doubt that those casings were fired from the same AR-style weapon.
Detectives also discovered that Bender's research had been thorough.
Gregory Bender went through multiple iterations of a murder plan.
He listed all the ways he was going to cover this up and get away with it. One of his plans was to poison him and make it look like he had overdosed on drugs. I don't know why he didn't go through with that plan. I think that was probably a little more involved than what his capabilities were, but those were the type of things that went through his head. That's how much thought that he put into this.
The one we found later on as well, when we had a handwriting expert, she could tell that there had been more writing. It had notes about a delivery or a package being delivered to the residence. So obvious that he was talking about killing Patrick de la Cerda. The details were frighteningly similar to what happened.
We really wanted to identify who this phone number was. We need to make sure there's no one else involved in this. Reading this murder plan that he had, he talks about having a getaway driver, dropping off some evidence and dropping off a car and getting money from a guy named Jeff. And so we really needed to make sure, hey, is there anyone else involved in this? Which we didn't believe so, but we have to make sure.
Gregory Bender was very smart. He knew not to take his cell phone up to Volusia County, because if he took his cell phone to Volusia County, he knew we would find out by tracking it on the cell phone towers that he went up there. So he went to the extent of getting what we call a burner phone, using the burner phone to go up there to contact Patrick's dad, Max de la Cerda, before committing the homicide, and even adding the extra layer of using an app to hide his burner phone number from Max de la Cerda when he called him. Law enforcement has tools and the ability to track that number back, even from the burner app to the burner phone.
So we really started focusing on that phone number that he used to set up the package delivery. We did get the call records from it, and the only phone call that it ever made was to a number that we identified as Greg Bender. He had had the phone for probably over a month, and it just sat in the area of his home. And the night before the murder, a text was sent from that phone to Gregory's phone.
We actually were able to use almost reverse evidence against him, or the absence of evidence, because while his phone never left his home when the homicide happened, there was no personal usage of his cell phone. Normally in his morning, he's on his phone, sending messages, surfing the web, using apps. For those 2 or 3 hours on the morning of February 27, 2018, nobody was using his phone. Things were coming in, nothing was going out. So it showed that he did not have his personal cell phone.
Police have to be sure that the evidence they have will be powerful enough to convict Bender.
There was no one else involved. This was all Gregory Bender. This was his plan, and it was executed by him with no one else's help.
The detectives are now convinced that all of the evidence they have discovered points conclusively to Gregory Bender. And now it is a case of getting a guilty verdict on their day in court from his prison cell.
What we do is we get together as a team, and we talk about strategy. We talk about evidence, we talk about motive, we talk about investigative findings. How did we come to this conclusion? Why is Greg Bender the person that killed Patrick? And during our preparation, we talk about interviews that were conducted. We talk about evidence that was collected, whether it be shell casings, technological evidence that we've collected for the case.
It was a long road, 2 years after the murder, that we finally got to see trial. And it was the worst years of my life. Leading up to the trial, everything was a blur. Every night was a nightmare.
Bender remains confident he will be cleared of all the charges against him in May 2021.
We monitor defendants' jail calls here in Volusia County. We have access to all the jail calls except for calls between somebody and their attorney. We don't get access to those, obviously. Up until the end, he was very confident and very controlling. He had a woman who he had talked to from the jail who would help manage things, manage his house, payments on his house, and he controlled her. But his confidence was very surprising considering the evidence we had against him.
Gregory Bender finally goes on trial for the murder of Patrick de la Cerda.
I was called in to testify as a witness, and I was interviewed or cross-examined by the defense. One of the things he really focused on was say that we weren't forthcoming and truthful in our investigation, and in fact accused myself and another detective of planting evidence referring to the shell casing.
I was the person who found the spent shell casing in Bender's home in Windermere. So when I was testifying and introducing that into the trial, the defense attorney questioned me. Did I plant evidence? It was in Bender's home. He put it there, and it matched the ones from the crime scene. I took a little bit of offense to that, of his line of questioning and kind of where things were going.
There was also accusations that one of our crime scene detectives had used his relationship with the crime lab to somehow sway the results, to try to inject some sort of doubt because this case was so well done and so well put together.
Bender's defense team now look for someone else to blame for Patrick's death. They even go so far as to accuse his closest family members of perpetrating the attack.
They had to find a scapegoat. They actually tried to blame it on Max de la Cerda and tried to say that Max somehow was obsessed with Jessica or didn't want his son to be with Jessica. And the way they did that was attacking Max when he testified. And he was a witness that they were able to rile a little bit. And he was the one they were going to try to blame as their scapegoat.
Throughout the trial, Gregory Bender remains detached and impassive.
It was very uncomfortable because I was facing the monster and he was staring at me. Most of the trial, he wouldn't take his eyes off of me, and that was very uncomfortable. But I knew that I needed to get on the stand and tell what happened so that it would bring justice to Patrick.
I remember sitting behind her and Patrick's family, and Bender at his defense table, able to look into the audience where we were, and he had like this psychotic stare, if you will, at her. Because in his mind, she's the source of all of this. If it wasn't for her, he maybe not be in this position, but his obsession with her, his jealousy of Patrick has put him behind the defense table, standing trial for the murder of Patrick. And so what he does, as one maybe last glimpse, Bender just stares at Jessica.
The trial reveals quite a lot about Gregory Bender's attitudes, particularly towards women.
At one point, he wouldn't stop staring at me, and they had to tell him, you know, you have to look away, you can't keep staring. And after one of the instances, he wanted to know who I was with when I attended one of the court dates. I brought my sister and my brother-in-law, and Bender thought that my brother-in-law was my new boyfriend. So he was still, even then, jealous of who I was with.
He had controlled these women, he controlled other women in his life, and he had this facade that he had it all together. He had a mansion in Orlando, he had all this money. He was rich and he knew how to get everyone else rich. When in the end, once we dug into some of his background, he wasn't rich. His life was just coming unraveled at the seams. His wife had left him, his girlfriend had left him, and he really had nothing left, and he couldn't swallow his pride enough to just move on.
Finally, Jessica gets her chance to take the stand and testify to the court.
It was very nerve-wracking, but I was confident because all I had to do was tell the truth, and that's what I did. And I just wanted justice for Patrick.
Having to sit there throughout the trial, be subject to cross-examination from the defense, to put her life under a microscope, to have to see others be accused of perhaps being responsible for Patrick's death. I'd say she is a strong person.
The jury retire and deliberate on the verdict.
I think it took about 2 hours while they were out, and of course, every minute feels like an hour when you're waiting for a verdict.
It was determined, a jury of his peers, that he indeed was guilty of murdering Patrick.
When the verdict was read and he was found guilty, there was a little bit of joy because justice, had been served and they had gotten justice for the murder of their son, but also sadness. We want to celebrate that his killer is, going to prison, but it's got to bring those emotions back to, their son, their fiance, their brother is still lost, and you never get to see him again.
So after being found guilty by a jury of his peers for the crime of first-degree murder, the judge then sentenced him to life in prison, which is where a person like Greg Bender belongs. Because if it wasn't Patrick, it would have been somebody else. Nothing was going to stop Greg Bender from getting what he thought was his, and only his, and that was Jessica.
As small of an idea as it had been at first, he had fed that idea for weeks and months and just continued to feed the bad idea of killing Patrick de la Cerda, that it became a reality.
I think he's a sociopath. I think Greg Bender thinks he's smarter than everyone. He's better than everyone. He's the only one that matters. He's the center of his universe, and he controls everyone that he wants to control.
We'll never get Patrick back, but at least the person who took away Patrick's life is now paying with his life in prison. He's never gonna get to drive his fancy cars. He's never gonna enjoy his big house. He's gonna be locked up in a tiny cell for the rest of his life.
With Bender behind bars, Jessica and Patrick's family now have justice for his senseless murder, but their sense of loss remains.
His mother loved him unconditionally, was just so saddened about him not being able to be happy and have the opportunities that he was going to have moving back to South Florida and to being with the woman he loved. It was heartbreaking to see how she felt.
Patrick is always in our thoughts. Like, there's never a day we're not thinking about him. We learn to deal with this, and we learn to live with this feeling, but it never goes away. We just learn to live with it. But we don't want to remember Patrick in that way, because he was full of light, and that's the way we want to live our lives. We want to bring that light into our lives.